Hi everyone, welcome to Think ETL. In our previous video, we have discussed how to call stored procedures using SQL Transformation in Informatica Cloud Mappings. In this video, let us focus on how to call SQL queries using SQL Transformation in Informatica Cloud Mappings. A SQL transformation can be used to process a SQL query either using a saved query or a user-entered query. The SQL transformation can return multiple output rows of the configured SQL query for each input row. That is, if the query returns a multiple output rows, the SQL transformation can also return those multiple output rows, which makes it an active transformation. So there are two types of SQL queries which can be created in a SQL transformation. One is a static SQL query and another one is a dynamic SQL query. Let us understand what is a static SQL query. A static SQL query runs the same query statement for each input row in SQL transformation, but the data of the query can be changed for each input row using the parameter binding in SQL editor. That means a same query would be run for each input row which is entered into the SQL transformation, but the data returned by the SQL statement can be changed using the parameter binding. So let us understand how we can implement static SQL queries using SQL transformation in Informatica Cloud using a problem statement. So this is the similar problem statement which we discussed in our previous SQL transformation videos, where we have a departments table which would give us the department's information which is used as a source. There is an employees table which would provide the salary details of the employees, and these two tables can be joined using a department ID field, and the requirement is to calculate the average salary of the employees in each department. So let's go to our Informatica Cloud mapping page. So I have the mapping ready, so let's get into the details. So as discussed, I have selected the departments table as my source, and I've added a SQL transformation after the source transformation. And in the SQL transformation SQL tab, I've selected my Oracle connection and selected the SQL type as SQL query and the query type as the entered query. And here is my query. So let's inspect what this query would do. So this query is basically joining the departments table and the employees table based on department ID, and we are calculating the average salary for each department. So there is also a filter condition here. So let me replace this with an actual value for the department ID. So let's say the department ID is 10. Let's run this query. So I got the average salary of the department ID 10, and if I replace the value with 20 as the department ID, I would get the average salary of the department ID 20. Okay. So when we go back to our Informatica Cloud mapping, we are replacing the department ID value with the department ID input field, and we are also enclosing the department ID field with question marks. So this is how parameter binding is used in a static SQL query. So we can simply use any of the input fields in our SQL query and add question marks to enclose them to use them as the binding parameters. Now let's go to the output fields tab. Since we are selecting two fields in our select statement, we need to create two output fields, one for each of them. So I have created two fields, department ID out and average salary out of type integer in the query fields tab using this plus symbol. We can also add the pass-through fields optionally. So these pass-through fields are the fields which are coming from the source. So I have selected department name as one of the pass-through field from my SQL transformation. Okay. So this is all about the SQL transformation configuration. So in my target, I have configured a table called department as my target table from the Oracle database. So I have also done the field mapping with the fields which I created. Department ID out, department name out is the pass-through field, and average salary out is one of the field which we are adding in our select statement. So let's save it and run it. Let's make sure there is no data available in our target table already. Okay, let's verify the status of our mapping. The mapping completed successfully. Let's verify the data again. So the data is now loaded as expected. So this completes the demo of static SQL in SQL Transformation. Let us now understand dynamic SQL queries in SQL Transformation. A dynamic SQL query can execute different query statements for each input row. In case of static SQL queries, we saw that the same SQL query is being executed for each input row, but the data which it returns is only getting varied. But in case of a dynamic SQL query, the entire query that is executed for each input row itself is going to vary. So there are two types of dynamic queries which we can pass to SQL Transformation. One is a full dynamic query and another one is a partial dynamic query. So let us understand both of them with a practical scenario. So what is a full dynamic query? The entire SQL query can be substituted with query statements from source. So as a problem statement, we have a list of DDL/DML SQL statements which needs to be executed using a SQL transformation in a mapping. So I have taken a flat file as a source for my mapping, and the flat file contains the query field as header, and it contains a create table statement and two insert statements and one select statement as the query statements in the file. So let's inspect the file once. So this is my currency code underscore SQL.txt file where query field is my header, and these are the statements. Each of these statements are passed as input rows to the mapping. Okay, so let's go back to our mapping and implement this one. Okay, so here is my mapping. So as discussed, I have selected the file as my input, and also I have changed the formatting options to the semicolon as my delimiter because my statements contains commas as part of the statement. So we need to change the delimiter in order to process the entire statement properly. So next I have added a SQL transformation next to my source transformation. In the SQL tab of SQL transformation, I have selected my Oracle connection and SQL query as my SQL type and entered query as my query type. As you can see, I have simply selected my input field query field into the query part and I have enclosed them both with a tilde field. So this is how a dynamic SQL query can be passed using the input fields. So let's go to the output fields tab. So here you can see I have created one output field called record count because one of my statement is a select statement and it contains one field which I am selecting as part of it. So whenever there is a SQL statement within your queries which you are executing using a SQL transformation, you must always create an output field. If not, there will be an error generated and the generated error is captured using the SQL error field. Okay. Next I have added query field coming from the source as my pass-through field. And in the target, I have configured a flat file. So let's save and run this mapping and view the output. The mapping completed successfully. Let's inspect the output. As there are no errors for our SQL statements, it means the SQL statements are executed successfully and the output of our select statement is captured under the record count field. So this concludes the demonstration of full dynamic SQL in SQL transformation. Now let us understand what is a partial dynamic query. Instead of passing the entire query as a string variable, we can also pass a portion of SQL query like table names as string variables with input fields coming from a source. So let us understand with the problem statement. So the requirement is to calculate the record count of tables present in a database using a SQL transformation in a mapping. So the table names are passed as source to the mapping. So for this, I have created a flat file with a list of all table names as my source, and this will be passed as input to the SQL transformation to calculate the record count of each of these tables and give it as an output to us. So let us see how to implement this in Informatica Cloud Mapping. So in my mapping, I have selected the flat file with a list of all the table names as my source, and this is passed to the SQL transformation. So as usual, I have selected my Oracle connection as connection, SQL query as SQL type, and entered query as query type. So here you can see my SQL query is select count star as record count from, and I have selected the table name which is an input field as a binding parameter. Okay, So let's go to the output field. Since there is only one field in our select statement, I created one output field which is the record count of type integer, and I have also selected the table name which is coming from the source as a pass-through field. And in the target, I have created a dynamic target to capture the output. Now let's save and run this mapping. So the mapping completed successfully. Let's inspect the output. As you can see, the record count of each of the tables are captured successfully. So this completes the demonstration of partial dynamic SQL in SQL Transformation. Now let us understand what is the passive mode in SQL Transformation. By default, when we are creating a SQL Transformation, it will be in active mode. That is, when a select query returns more than one row, it will return all the rows from the SQL Transformation. But we can also configure a SQL Transformation to be in a passive mode. That is, when you configure the transformation to be a passive transformation, the data integration will only return the first row, and it will generate a SQL error which states that SQL Transformation generated multiple rows in the SQL error field. So let's see how we can make a SQL Transformation passive. Go to the SQL Transformation, go to the Advanced tab. In the behavior, select passive. Here are the supported SQL statements in SQL Transformation. We can use a variety of DDL, DML and DCL statement types. So that's it in this video. I hope this is informative. You can also find all this information in our blog post. I'll share the link in the description. If you find this informative, please like, share and subscribe. I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.